Sarah Martinez wiped down the same table for the third time, her movements automatic after 15 years of working at Mike's Diner on the outskirts of Fort Campbell. The morning rush had ended, leaving behind the usual mess of coffee rings and crumpled napkins. At 42, she had become invisible to most customers who passed through the worn doors of the establishment. They saw only the uniform, the coffee pot in her hand, and the tired smile she offered with each order. The diner sat on a forgotten stretch of highway, catching the overflow from the military base nearby. Soldiers came and went like seasons, but Sarah remained constant. She knew their ranks by the patches on their uniforms, understood their slang, and could tell which ones were heading overseas by the weight in their eyes. Yet despite serving thousands of military personnel over the years, she was just another face in their busy lives. Sarah's own story remained locked away behind her professional demeanor. Nobody knew that she had once worn a uniform herself. Nobody knew about the tours in Afghanistan, the convoy she had led through hostile territory, or the medal tucked away in a shoebox under her bed. The transition back to civilian life had been harder than any battlefield she had faced. The nightmares, the inability to find work that matched her military experience, and the gradual erosion of her confidence had led her to this small-town diner. Her manager, Pete, barely acknowledged her except to point out mistakes or remind her about the broken coffee machine that needed constant attention. The other waitresses treated her with polite distance, perhaps sensing something different about her but never bothering to dig deeper. Sarah preferred it that way. Keeping her past buried felt safer than facing the questions and the pity that might follow. The lunch crowd began filtering in as Sarah refilled salt shakers with practiced efficiency. A group of young recruits occupied a corner booth, their voices loud with the bravado of those who had never seen real combat. She served them with the same neutral expression she wore for everyone, listening to their theories about warfare and strategy with a mixture of amusement and sadness. They had no idea that the woman refilling their coffee had once called in airstrikes and made life-or-death decisions in the heat of battle. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah noticed the usual pattern of customers. Truck drivers grabbed quick meals before continuing their routes. Local workers stopped by for coffee and gossip. A few tourists, lost on their way to more interesting destinations, studied maps while picking at oversized burgers. Each interaction followed a script that Sarah knew by heart, each customer seeing only what they expected to see. The day seemed destined to end like countless others before it, with Sarah counting her modest tips and walking home to her small apartment above the hardware store. She had no way of knowing that tomorrow would bring a visitor who would change everything, someone who would see past the coffee-stained apron to the soldier she had once been. For now, she simply continued her routine, invisible in plain sight, carrying the weight of her hidden identity like a secret burden that grew heavier with each passing day. The next morning brought an unusual buzz to Mike's Diner. Word had spread through the small town that someone important was expected at the military base. Sarah noticed the extra polish on the boots of the soldiers who stopped by for breakfast, the sharper creases in their uniforms, and the nervous energy that accompanied visits from high-ranking officials. Sarah went about her morning routine, filling coffee cups and taking orders while listening to fragments of conversation. The soldiers spoke in hushed tones about inspections and presentations, clearly anxious about making good impressions. She had seen this dance many times before during her own military service, the careful choreography that preceded visits from the upper ranks. Around 10 in the morning, a convoy of black vehicles rolled past the diner's windows. Sarah caught a glimpse of military police escorts and the kind of security detail that suggested someone very important was inside. The young soldiers in the diner pressed their faces to the windows, trying to catch a glimpse of whoever commanded such attention. The lunch rush brought more than the usual crowd. Off-duty personnel who normally ate on base had ventured out, perhaps hoping to avoid the heightened scrutiny that came with VIP visits. Sarah found herself working faster than usual, weaving between tables with practiced grace while her mind wandered to memories of her own encounters with senior officers. She remembered the day General Harrison had visited her forward operating base in Afghanistan. Sarah had been a staff sergeant then, responsible for a team of combat engineers. She had briefed the general on mine-clearing operations, her voice steady despite the weight of his attention. He had listened carefully, asked pointed questions, and later recommended her for promotion. That moment felt like a lifetime ago, buried beneath years of civilian struggle. As the afternoon dragged on, Sarah noticed Pete becoming increasingly agitated. He snapped at the cook, criticized the other waitresses, and generally made everyone miserable with his nervous energy. Apparently, he had heard rumors that important military personnel might visit local establishments, and the thought of hosting high-ranking officers in his modest diner both thrilled and terrified him. The dinner crowd was unusually subdued, as if the entire town was holding its breath. Sarah worked through the evening shift, her feet aching and her back sore from the constant motion. The tips were slightly better than usual, perhaps because the soldiers felt generous or because they appreciated the refuge the diner provided from the heightened tension on base. As closing time approached, Sarah began the familiar routine of wiping down tables and preparing for the next day. She had no idea that across town in the visiting officers' quarters, General Patricia Williams was reviewing files and making plans that would soon intersect with Sarah's carefully hidden past. The general had a reputation for thorough research and attention to detail, qualities that would soon bring her to an unexpected encounter at a small diner on the edge of nowhere. Sarah finished her shift and walked home through the quiet streets, unaware that tomorrow would shatter the anonymity she had built so carefully. The evening air carried the distant sound of military vehicles, a reminder of the world she had left behind but could never entirely escape. Sarah arrived at work the following morning to find Pete in an unprecedented state of panic. He had received a call from someone claiming to represent a visiting general who wanted to experience authentic local dining. Pete had barely slept, alternating between excitement at the prestige and terror at the prospect of disappointing such important guests. The morning passed slowly, with Pete adjusting everything from the angle of the napkin dispensers to the temperature of the coffee. He had insisted that Sarah and the other staff polish every surface until the modest diner gleamed as much as its worn fixtures would allow. The cook, normally surly and uncommunicative, had been recruited to prepare special menu items that Pete hoped would impress their distinguished visitors. Sarah watched the preparations with a mixture of amusement and anxiety. She knew military protocol well enough to understand that high-ranking officers rarely made unscheduled stops at random diners. Something about this visit felt different, though she could not pinpoint exactly what triggered her unease. Around noon, the black convoy that had passed the previous day pulled into the diner's small parking lot. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as she recognized the level of security accompanying the vehicles. Military police took positions around the perimeter, while plainclothes personnel conducted a quick sweep of the area. Pete stood frozen behind the counter, his earlier bravado evaporating as the reality of the situation hit him. Sarah automatically moved to her assigned section, straightening her apron and checking that her order pad was ready. Years of military training had taught her to remain calm under pressure, even as her civilian persona threatened to crack under the weight of the moment. The diner's front door opened, and a woman in an immaculate dress uniform entered. 4 stars adorned her shoulders, marking her as one of the highest-ranking officers in the entire military. General Patricia Williams moved with the confident bearing that comes from decades of command, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the humble establishment. Sarah felt a chill of recognition, though she was certain they had never met. Something about the general's posture and the way she carried herself triggered memories of Sarah's own military service, when she had stood at attention before officers who held the power to shape destinies with a single decision. The general's aide approached Pete, who managed to stammer out a welcome despite his obvious nervousness. The general requested a quiet table where she could conduct some business while enjoying a meal. Pete immediately directed them to the best booth in the house, frantically signaling for Sarah to take care of their important guests. As Sarah approached the table, she noticed the general studying her with unusual intensity. Those piercing eyes seemed to see beyond the coffee-stained uniform to something deeper. Sarah introduced herself with practiced professionalism, offering menus and taking drink orders while fighting to keep her voice steady. General Williams ordered simply, declining the special items Pete had prepared in favor of basic coffee and a sandwich. Her aide, a young major who seemed barely old enough for his rank, appeared almost as nervous as Pete. Throughout the exchange, the general continued to watch Sarah with an expression that suggested recognition. Though Sarah remained convinced they were strangers, the meal proceeded quietly, with the general occasionally making notes in a leather portfolio while speaking in low tones with her aide. Sarah provided efficient service while maintaining the invisible presence that had become her trademark. Yet she could not shake the feeling that this encounter was far from coincidental, that forces beyond her understanding were converging on this unremarkable Tuesday afternoon. General Williams finished her coffee and closed the leather portfolio with deliberate precision. The aide moved to stand, clearly expecting their departure, but the general remained seated. Her gaze fixed on Sarah, who was refilling water glasses at a nearby table, trying to maintain her professional invisibility despite the growing tension she felt. Sarah approached to clear their table, moving with the efficient grace that came from years of practice. As she reached for the general's empty cup, the older woman spoke in a voice that carried the authority of command mixed with something unexpected. "Staff Sergeant Martinez," the general said quietly, using a rank and name that Sarah had not heard spoken aloud in over a decade. Sarah's hand froze halfway to the coffee cup. The water pitcher in her other hand trembled slightly as the carefully constructed walls of her civilian identity began to crumble. Around them, the diner continued its normal rhythm. But for Sarah, everything had suddenly stopped. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I think you have me confused with someone else," Sarah managed to say, though her voice lacked conviction. The general's knowing look made it clear that there would be no hiding behind mistaken identity. General Williams opened the portfolio again and withdrew a photograph. It showed a younger Sarah in military fatigues, standing beside a damaged convoy in what was clearly a hostile environment. The image captured a moment of triumph, when Sarah's team had successfully cleared a road that had been considered impassable due to improvised explosive devices. Operation Enduring Freedom. "Afghanistan 2009, the general said, her voice carrying both respect and recognition. "You and your team cleared 12 miles of Route Falcon in 18 hours despite constant enemy fire. Your actions saved countless lives and kept a crucial supply line open." Sarah felt the eyes of everyone in the diner turning toward them. Pete stood behind the counter with his mouth agape, while the other customers sensed something significant was happening without understanding exactly what. The young soldiers who had been joking about military tactics suddenly found themselves in the presence of someone who had actually lived those experiences. "Ma'am, I don't understand why you're here," Sarah said, struggling to maintain her composure as memories she had tried to bury came flooding back. The smell of diesel fuel and burning metal, the weight of her equipment, the faces of teammates who had not made it home. The general's expression softened slightly, though her bearing remained commanding. "Because people like you should never be forgotten, Martinez. Because heroes shouldn't have to serve coffee to make ends meet while wearing a smile that hides their pain." The major beside her looked confused, clearly not understanding the significance of what was unfolding. Pete had moved closer, straining to hear the conversation that was transforming his understanding of the woman he had worked alongside for years. Other customers had stopped eating, sensing the gravity of the moment without comprehending its full meaning. Sarah felt tears threatening for the first time in years. The armor she had built around her emotions began to crack under the weight of recognition she had never expected to receive. She had accepted her invisibility, embraced the anonymity that allowed her to hide from the memories and the sense of failure that had driven her from the military. "I couldn't do it anymore," Sarah whispered, her professional mask finally slipping. "After what happened to my team, after Rodriguez and Chen didn't make it home, I couldn't be responsible for other people's lives. I couldn't carry that weight." General Williams stood slowly, her 4 stars catching the light from the diner's fluorescent fixtures. Around them, absolute silence had fallen as everyone waited to see what would happen next. The general's aide reached for his camera, understanding that he was witnessing something that needed to be documented, even if he did not fully comprehend its significance. General Williams stood at attention, her 4 stars gleaming under the diner's fluorescent lights. What happened next would be remembered by everyone present for the rest of their lives. The highest-ranking officer in the building, a woman who commanded respect from presidents and prime ministers, raised her right hand in a perfect military salute directed at the woman, who had been serving coffee just moments before. "Staff, Sergeant Sarah Martinez," the general said in a voice that carried throughout the silent diner. "On behalf of a grateful nation and the United States Army, I salute your service, your sacrifice, and your courage." The silence that followed was profound. Pete stood frozen behind the counter, his understanding of his employee completely transformed. The young soldiers at the corner booth slowly rose to their feet, instinctively recognizing the significance of what they were witnessing. Other customers, though civilian, sensed the gravity of the moment and remained respectfully quiet. Sarah felt 20 years of hidden pain and unacknowledged service crystallizing into this single moment. Her hand moved automatically to return the salute, muscle memory taking over as her civilian facade crumbled completely. For the first time since leaving the military, she stood as the soldier she had always been, accepting the recognition she had never thought she deserved. The general held the salute for a full 10 seconds, allowing everyone present to understand the depth of respect being shown. When she finally lowered her hand, the spell was broken. But something fundamental had changed in the small diner. Sarah was no longer invisible. She never would be again. "The Army failed you, Martinez," General Williams said, her voice carrying personal regret along with institutional acknowledgement. "We didn't provide the support you needed when you came home. We allowed a decorated combat veteran to slip through the cracks and disappear into obscurity. That ends today." The general's aide had documented the entire exchange, understanding now why they had made this unscheduled stop. This was not about experiencing local dining. This was about honoring forgotten heroes and correcting oversights that should never have occurred. Sarah wiped away tears she could no longer contain, years of suppressed emotion finally finding release. The young soldiers who had been discussing military tactics with casual bravado now looked at her with newfound respect and curiosity. They began to understand that real heroism often wore ordinary clothes and served coffee with quiet dignity. Pete approached hesitantly, his previous indifference to Sarah's capabilities now seeming shamefully inadequate. "Sarah, I had no idea. If there's anything you need, anything at all." His voice trailed off as he realized how little he actually knew about the person who had worked for him faithfully for 15 years. Other customers began to approach, some thanking Sarah for her service, others simply wanting to shake her hand. Word spread quickly through the small town that something extraordinary had happened at Mike's Diner, that a 4-star general had come specifically to honor a waitress who turned out to be a war hero. The general spent another hour in the diner, talking with Sarah about her experiences and outlining opportunities that would allow her to use her skills and experience in meaningful ways. Job offers, educational opportunities, and veteran support programs were discussed with the efficiency of someone accustomed to solving complex problems. As the convoy prepared to leave, Sarah found herself changed in ways she could not have imagined that morning. The isolation she had maintained for years had been shattered by recognition and respect from the highest levels of the military establishment. She was no longer hiding from her past, but ready to embrace a future that honored her service and utilized her considerable talents. 6 months later, Sarah Martinez stood before a congressional committee in Washington, D.C., no longer wearing a coffee-stained apron, but dressed in a sharp business suit that reflected her new role as Director of Veteran Transition Services. The position had been created specifically for her, designed to ensure that other combat veterans would never slip through the cracks as she had. The transformation had not been immediate or easy. Years of hidden trauma and suppressed identity could not be healed overnight, but with proper support, counseling, and the recognition she had finally received, Sarah began to reclaim the confidence and sense of purpose that military service had once provided. Mike's Diner had become something of a local landmark after news of the general's visit spread beyond the small town. Visitors came from across the country to eat at the place where a 4-star general had saluted a waitress, turning Pete's modest establishment into an unlikely symbol of respect for veterans. Pete had framed the photograph of the salute, hanging it prominently behind the counter where everyone could see. The young soldiers who had witnessed the moment became ambassadors of Sarah's story, spreading word throughout Fort Campbell and beyond about the decorated veteran who had been hiding in plain sight. Many of them sought her out for advice and mentorship as they prepared for their own deployments, understanding now that real wisdom often came from unexpected sources. Sarah's new position allowed her to implement programs based on her own difficult experience transitioning to civilian life. She worked with military commanders to identify at-risk veterans before they left service, created support networks for those struggling with civilian employment, and established partnerships with businesses willing to recognize the value of military experience. General Williams had kept in touch, occasionally checking on Sarah's progress and offering guidance when bureaucratic obstacles threatened to slow her work. The general's recognition had opened doors that Sarah never knew existed, providing access to resources and influential people who shared her commitment to veteran welfare. The impact of that single moment in the diner had rippled outward in ways none of them had anticipated. Sarah's story became part of military leadership training, demonstrating the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to recognize hidden talent and unacknowledged service. The photograph of the salute was used in recruitment materials, showing potential enlistees that their service would be remembered and honored long after their uniforms were stored away. For Sarah personally, the most significant change was internal. The shame and sense of failure that had driven her into hiding had been replaced by renewed purpose and pride in her service. She no longer saw herself as someone who had given up, but as someone who had overcome extraordinary challenges to find new ways of serving her country and fellow veterans. The diner still operated under Pete's management, but Sarah occasionally returned to visit, now greeted as a respected community leader rather than an invisible employee. She used these visits to remind herself of how far she had traveled, both literally and figuratively, from the woman who had once felt forgotten by the world. Standing before the congressional committee, preparing to testify about veteran services, Sarah reflected on the power of recognition and respect. A single salute had changed everything, not just for her but for countless other veterans who would benefit from the programs she now administered. General Williams had been right that day in the diner. Heroes should never be forgotten, and Sarah had dedicated her new life to ensuring they never would be again.